Hi, John Gregory here with some more tips and tutorials. Today we're going to talk about filters. In particular, we're going to talk about filter basics and filters for realistic color. So this is a part one of two series. I will cover filters for black and white and special effects in the next video. First of all, I'd like to talk about how a lot of filtration is misunderstood, especially by beginning photographers. The realm of filters seems to be something that's mysterious, that's only for professionals, and they don't know a whole lot about it. So the idea here with this video is to give you a basic understanding about filters and how they work, so you can go out and experiment on your own and use what you want for filtration to get the look and the effect that you would like. Just like camera manufacturers, there's a lot of different filter manufacturers. Each one has their idiosyncrasies and a particular look or feel to the resulting image. I'm not here to recommend a particular brand or variety. There are two basic designs to filters. There is the round threaded type, which screws on or threads onto the front surface of the lens. It looks something like this, and you just simply spin it on to the lens and you thread it on. The second type is a square or rectangular filter. Looks something like this. They require a special device that goes onto the front of the lens to hold them, so they're a little bit different. Let's talk about quality for a second. You can't go into filters very far without talking about different types of quality. The first thing that we should mention is that there are two basic materials that filters are used or made out of. There is glass, and then there is what's called resin or plastic. I tend to prefer glass. There are really good manufacturers of both resin as well as glass, and there's some poor manufacturers of both resin as well as glass. I'll make some recommendations on brands a little bit later on, but again, my purpose isn't to promote a particular brand, but to give you the basic understanding. One of the things that I don't do, which you may have heard from a lot of people in camera stores in particular, is that you should always buy a UV filter to put on the front of your lens. I don't like UV filters. I don't like them for a couple of reasons. One, if you have a UV filter on the front of your lens, if you want to put another filter on, you're stacking filters. Stacking filters is something I try to avoid. There are times when I do stack filters, but as a general rule, I try not to stack filters. Also, if you're working with a wide-angle lens, you may run into problems with vignettes. And vignettes are where you catch the corner of something like a lens shade or a filter barrel on the corners of the photograph, and they darken them down, and then you have to crop in or fix it or something, and I don't like to have to mess with that. So I don't use a UV filter. I don't like them. I use basically for color, for realistic color landscape. I've been working with filters intensively for the last year, and so I've changed some of how I work. But I work with basically about 4 different types of filters, four different filters that I have in my filter kit. I use a polarizing filter, which is a circular filter, and it threads on when I need to polarize. And then I use square filters that I put into the holder, and I like using the square filters rather than the screw-on ones. You can get screw-on ones that do the same thing as the square ones, but for me, the square ones are a lot quicker and a lot easier. Let's look at how I use filters. In particular, let's look at how I use the square filters. I use a filter holder. The particular one that I use is a Koken holder, C-O-K-I-N, Koken Pro Z as in zebra. And it consists of 2 parts, an adapter ring which threads onto the front of the lens. So we just spin this on, and then the actual part that holds the filters, which slides right on. And now I'm ready to put filters in. And I use 2 types of filters, of square filters. I use a solid neutral density and I use what's called a graduated neutral density. You can see that the graduated neutral density is a little different. It's dark on top and clear on the bottom. And it's a gradual shift from clear to the neutral density. And so you can place that in front of the lens and then adjust that line wherever your horizon line is. And so you can accommodate darkening down of the sky. And I'll show you an example of that a little bit later on. For straight neutral density, I have two neutral density filters that I use. I have a 6-stop and a 3-stop. When I'm using the 6-stop, I usually put it in the slot that's closest to the lens. This particular holder can accommodate up to 2 filters in it, which is really nice because when I do need to use 2 filters, it's handy to be able to have both of them in a holder at the same time. So rather than have a thread-on neutral density, I use a square neutral density and then the graduated neutral density too. For the square filters, and the ones that I use are square, I have four filters that I use. I use a 6-stop solid, a 3-stop solid, a 2-stop graduated neutral density, and a 3-stop graduated neutral density. So if I'm using the neutral density to lengthen my shutter speed for some reason, I can slip the graduated neutral density in front if I need to darken the sky down as well. I mentioned that I would discuss brands. There are a few brands that I am comfortable in mentioning and saying that I think you'll get good results. They're a combination of glass as well as resin. One is Schneider, that's the particular brand that you see me working with right here. Stingray has both resin as well as glass filters. Tiffin primarily works with glass filters. And B&W, or they're also part of the Schneider brand, those are almost always thread-on filters. Lee, which makes the rather infamous Lee Big Stopper, which is a 10-stop neutral density filter. High-Tech Format, and View. All those companies make good quality filters, but just like cameras and lens manufacturers, some are better than others. So in other words, not all Lee filters may be really good, or not all Schneider filters may be really good. It comes down to the specific filter, and those are tastes that will run the gamut. Different photographers will have different preferences in how they use them. There is one type of filter that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's called a reverse neutral density. It's very similar to the split neutral density, with the exception that it's a little bit darker right in the middle here. The idea being that if you place the sun on the horizon, it's usually in the middle, and so you need to darken the middle area of the image more than the upper part or the lower part. For myself, I don't use a reverse neutral density. It's not the style of photography that I do. I'm usually not looking right at the sun when it's coming up or setting. I tend to be looking 90 degrees either direction, but that's my personal taste. I mentioned vignetting with using filters, and that's one of the problems that you have to watch out for when you're using filters. So you want a setup that won't vignette your images or cause problems with darkening in the corners. One of the best setups that I've worked with is this Koken Z holder. It's large enough this way that I can use up to 2 filters and not cause a vignette even with a wide angle lens, like this 17-40 that I have on the camera right now. I can use 2 filters with this particular setup at 17 millimeters and not get much vignetting. It just starts to darken the corners just a touch. So it's a pretty wide angle with a minimum effect of vignetting. The second thing that I do when I'm buying a round filter, when I'm using a round filter, is I get a slimline filter. And that is the distance here of the filter. I want to make sure it's real narrow. So this is a standard, or a trim slimline rather, and this one is a standard. The top one is a standard. And you'll see that it is slightly thicker. The standard is slightly thicker than what the thin streamlined one is. It may not look like a big difference, but when you're using it on the front of the lens, it can make the difference as whether or not it vignettes. So I buy the streamlined variety when I'm using the threaded filters. And I usually don't stack them, because if you stack thread-on filters, chances are you're going to get a vignette. The other thing that I do is I get the largest size that my lens is. So if the largest lens that I have has a filter size of 77 millimeters, that's what I buy. I buy a 77 millimeter sized filter, and then I use a step-down ring, what's called a step-down ring, to go to my smaller size filter sizes, and it's less expensive that way. You can buy the best quality glass and just use a step-down ring to get to the smaller size filters. Okay, here we are on location, and I'm going to demonstrate the use of a split neutral density filter. This is the scene with no filter, and now I'm going to apply the filter, slide it into the holder, and then I'm going to adjust it to bring the sky deeper so you can see that the sky is darker on the top now without affecting the bottom. Here's another scene, and I'm going to demonstrate the use of a polarizer. I've got a polarizer on the front of my lens right now, and now I'm going to just turn it to darken it up a little bit and saturate the colors more. You'll notice that they darkened down and saturated. So just by turning the front of that polarizer, that gives us that extra saturation and pop in the image. Here we have some examples of the use of various neutral density filters. In this case we have a waterfall. You can see that there's a lot of texture to the water here. This was shot at about 1/160th of a second. If we take the same picture but use a neutral density filter, we're able to get the exposure down to about 20 seconds or so, and it smooths the water out considerably. Here we have a beach scene with a lake, and this picture is taken at twilight. The exposure is about 1/130th of a second. If we put a neutral density filter on, we're able to get the exposure down to 30 seconds, and we've smoothed the water out and taken out any texture off the water. We still have a nice texture in the sand in the foreground, and there's a wonderful play between that texture and the smoothness of the water. Using these techniques, we can create very impactful photographs. Images that are a little bit different than the everyday scene. It extends the image a little bit more and opens up all kinds of possibilities for us. Here we have an example of a daylight photograph of a tree in the wind. So anything that is moving has moved during the 30-second exposure that was required to take this image. Everything that was stable, that didn't move, is sharp and intact. And there's a wonderful play between those things. Here we have another example of the split neutral density, the graduated neutral density, where we'll be able to bring out a nice, wonderful, rich, colorful sky, but still maintain the color in the foreground. I hope some of these ideas and techniques for filters have helped you and has added an extra dimension to your photography.